Welcome to it right here at the JSE. It's a big week this week. We've got news coming out from the US side that earnings season is going to kick off on Wednesday. And of course, we do have the banks leading the charge there. But let's look at what happened on the Asian side. We did see the Asia Pacific markets mostly weaker, with the Chinese side of shares taking in some sizable losses. Starting off with what's happening on the Hong Kong, Japan side of things. We're going to start rolling those markets so you could see the exact picture as it comes to the numbers. But in Nikkei, in Japan, we did see the Nikkei down about 1.07%, the Hang Seng down 1.1% rather, and the Shanghai and Shenzhen Composite mostly unchanged. But the news coming out of Japan, of course, is that Alibaba, of course, we did see that share price soar about 6.5%, and that's on the back of Chinese regulators slapping the firm with a fine of about $2.8 billion in its anti-monopoly probe. But looking at how things played out in Europe, of course, markets also weaker there following global peers as well. Looking at the FTSE 100, that losing 0.6%. The French CAC and German DAX, little change this morning. US futures lower, perhaps indicating that we might not see much of a performance later on as we start to look at the S&P 500 and, of course, the Dow Jones. But looking at the, of course, JSE, weaker along with its global peers as well. Of course, it's the COVID-19 pandemic that's taking theme here, and, of course, probably muting that economic recovery process that we were seeing last week. Of course, the banking financials a little bit weaker, but we're going to break down all of those specific sectors with our market watcher who joins me via virtual platform, of course. That is Bright Kamala from Vestec Asset Management. Bright, thank you so much for your time. We looked at the numbers on screen and we looked at how the performance is playing out on the Asian front, rather how it played out on the Asian front. But looking at the JSE right now, what do you make of the current performance?
Yes, I mean, the performance of the market, I guess it is what it is. We've seen, like you said, all-time highs in the United States or North America, so S&P 500. We've seen the NASDAQ actually bouncing back quite strongly after, the sectoral rotation that we've seen, with the likes of the tech stocks being out of favor and obviously more industrial stocks, which, is led by, the push to ESG, which is actually, real economy businesses. Because, if you're talking about ESG, for example, you're talking about mining things like lithium and other minerals from the ground, which, needs hard labor. So you're seeing more and more of those industrial companies actually becoming more and more relevant again, especially also in the semiconductor space. We've seen the Dow as a result bouncing back quite sharply. And finally, the tech stocks also seem to be coming back after that sectoral rotation I was referring to.
So, I mean, it's quite interesting that you mention, S&P, the Dow as well. If you look at trading volumes on Friday on the US side of things, they were quite low. You look at the VIX index reaching its lowest since February last year. My question then is, what's the main question that you guys are asking yourselves at Vestec when you're looking at the US markets at this particular stage?
Look, if you look at North American markets specifically, I mean, they are pricing in basically a COVID-free 18 months. So we've got until 18 months until, we're COVID-free in North America, which I guess, by COVID-free, what I mean is you're still going to have, those rare cases and, those old cases, but it will no longer be a pandemic, right? So, with the United States administering about 3 million vaccines a day, they're up from 2 million the last time I was on the show. So they're doing really great in terms of administering that vaccine. So it's basically what the market is signaling to us is that. And I think it was Friday where we hit 750 million in terms of worldwide, and this is all going to help in global or United States or North American economic recovery, because it's very important to see how fast you administer this vaccine and how fast those individuals that work in those different jurisdictions go back to work. That will be the biggest determinant of how well your economy does in 2021.
On Wednesday, we have U.S. earnings season kicking off. What's on your radar?
Look, excuse me, in the earnings front, it's always an interesting one. The first week is all about financial services companies and mostly, big banks. So you'll see the likes of Citibank, Morgan Stanley, you'll see Goldman Sachs, and obviously the biggest of them all, which is JP Morgan, and the one we own here at Vestact. So we're going to be watching JP Morgan quite closely, and another one which is random, which usually also release their numbers at the same time as J&J. So we're going to be watching those very closely. And on the ESG side of things and investing, we're going to be watching BlackRock as well there, because I mean, as an investment manager, I'm very interested to see what the biggest asset manager in the world is performing.
So, I mean, you guys have a stake in, you hold JP Morgan, and a lot of the other banks are quite diversified. Do you think that it'll be the traditional lenders or the capital markets intensive ones like your Goldman Sachs that would outperform? How are you seeing the banking sphere on that side?
Look, we saw in December that, the guys that are financial engineers like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanleys of the world, they saw a very big bounce in their earnings because there were IPOs left, right, and center, right? And the more diversified banks like the JP Morgans of the world had good numbers as well, relatively speaking, and, with relation to where we were in terms of, economic recovery. So that, most of those banks actually outperformed. So we expect the more diversified banks to do a little bit better, mainly because we basically saw the markets turn very sour for new IPOs in the first quarter. So there won't be too much excitement there. And those ones that were, the big IPOs that we've seen, and most importantly, the SPACs, they sort of fizzled out towards the end of the quarter, but we still saw a record in terms of SPAC sponsors and SPACs coming into the market, but actually they didn't do as well as the ones that did in December. So I guess the sponsors are still going to get some money somewhat, but it won't be as much as we've seen in December.
What has you scared for the next 6 months? I mean, if you had to encompass both South Africa and the US right now.
The one thing I'm really scared about is that, in a long enough timeline, we're all dead. I think we all worry about that. But in terms of, the markets, locally for me, it has to be the rollout of the vaccine, because, like I said, it's going to be the biggest determinant of where we go in terms of economic recovery and coming back to work. Whereas in America, I'm less worried, or in the rest of the world, I'm less worried about that as compared to locally. For example, I was saying in the United States, we got about 3 million vaccine shots administered a day. In South Africa, we had a weekend where we've got 0 administered, and we still don't know the direction going forward, except for the last set of news we heard on the vaccine front is that we're going to get some, down in the Eastern Cape from the Aspen facility there, but there hasn't been any news further than that on how it's going to be administered. For example, key individuals in key sectors, how they're going to get the vaccine is still a mystery to me. So that's a big problem for Mzansi, and hopefully we can, take best practices of, other areas like Israel that have done well in terms of rollout of the vaccine and actually copy paste. You don't have to think much when it comes to administering the vaccine here.
All right, before I let you go, outside of US earnings, any other key events you'll be keeping an eye on?
I mean, locally, Capitec, PSG, Zida, EOH, all releasing their numbers, so we're going to be watching those quite closely. We do have, keen interest in some of them, even though we don't have stakes in them. And obviously, Stats SA is going to release the mining production numbers. The mining production numbers for February, which we're going to be watching those closely, mainly because most of our, the GDP growth has been actually coming from this very cyclical sector of the economy, which is mining. So we're going to be watching those very closely as well.
All right, Bright, thank you so much for your time. That is Bright Khumalo from Vestac Asset Management. That's it from us at the JSE. We'll have more news after this break.